Chapter 4. The Jews. Jews came to America not from one country or culture, but from many. The first Jews who arrived in colonial America were Sephardic Jews, who had lived for centuries in Spain and Portugal, under very different conditions from those in Germany, Russia, or Eastern Europe, from which later generations of Jewish Americans came. Culturally, these were all different groups, however much they might be lumped together by outsiders. They have not entirely blended together to this day. The great majority of Jews in America are descended from the millions who emigrated from Russia, Poland, and other Eastern European countries in the last 2 decades of the 19th century and the first 2 decades of the 20th century. In that period, 1/3 of all the Jews in Eastern Europe migrated to America. Although divided by national cultures and even internal differences of religious theory and practice, Jews shared not only their ancestral origins in ancient Israel and a core of common religious beliefs and traditions, but also centuries of history as a minority subjected to varying degrees of hostility wherever they went. Other groups became minorities in America. Jews had centuries of experience living as a minority in countries throughout Europe. Homelands. The ancient Jews were forced from their ancestral homeland in 70 AD, when the armies of the Roman Empire conquered Palestine. Thus began the diaspora, the long centuries of their dispersion throughout Europe and eventually the world. After Christianity replaced paganism throughout Europe, the Jews were the only non-Christian people on the continent, the universal outsiders. This was a particularly vulnerable position during periods of Christian religious fervor, such as the Crusades, or periods of great religious fear, as during the plagues that sporadically decimated whole regions during the Middle Ages. As the Crusaders moved through Europe to go fight the Muslims, they often paused to massacre the Jews in places along the way, joined by local mobs. When the devastating plagues struck Europe, many saw them as a sign of God's anger, which they hoped to placate by getting rid of the Jews living in their midst. In addition to these more or less straightforward motives of bigotry and fear, there were also many who stood to gain materially from eliminating a people who were seen as economic or religious competitors, or holders of debts that would be liquidated with their deaths and the deaths of their heirs. The profound ignorance of the masses of people during this era made them readily manipulatable by more shrewd political, economic, or religious leaders who directed their passions against the Jews. For centuries, Jews were periodically persecuted, massacred, or expelled en masse from various countries in Europe. In between these dramatic historic events, Jews sought whatever unobtrusive safety they could find as an interstitial element in different cultures, societies, and economies. Jewish resistance by force would have been suicidal, as they were hopelessly outnumbered everywhere. The oppressed Irish or Italians were a majority in their respective lands, and could at least conduct sporadic uprisings or underground terrorism against their conquerors. But while oppression bred fighting qualities in the Irish and the Italians, in the very different situation of the Jews, it produced an emphasis on the futility of the use of force and violence, and reliance instead on their wits, resourcefulness, and perseverance in the face of adversity. When the Jews were a people living in their own homeland in Palestine, they were a fighting people, as they would be once again in modern Israel, but not so in the long centuries of their dispersion. The position of the Jews was, in many ways, better during the early centuries of the Roman Empire than in its later decline or in the emergence of medieval Europe. The early Roman Empire was pagan and pluralistic. The Jews were simply one of many diverse racial and religious groups accommodated within a relatively tolerant empire. Ironically, it was the Judeo-Christian theology that introduced a major element of intolerance into the Roman Empire and into Western civilization in general. Neither Jews nor Christians would engage in the rites or observances of mutual respect that were common among many religions in ancient Rome. To do so would be idolatry. Both were punished by the authorities of the Roman Empire for their politically disruptive attitudes and practices. But this was not religious persecution in the sense later to become all too familiar in medieval and modern Europe. With the eventual triumph of Christianity as the state religion of the Roman Empire, religious intolerance emerged in the sense of forced conversions and punishment of heretics or infidels not accepting the one true faith. The number of Christians killed by other Christians in religious controversies in the later Roman Empire far exceeded the number ever put to death by the Romans in pagan times. Jews were among the many victims of this religious militancy. With the eventual triumph of one unified doctrine in the West, Roman Catholicism, Jews were left isolated as the only major religious minority. The same theological concept, idolatry, that made the Christians unwilling to compromise with the pagans made the Jews unwilling to compromise with the Christians, or vice versa. The Jews were not simply religious dissenters, serious as that would have been in that era. Because of their dispersion after their own homeland was conquered, they were also an alien people in country after country, bearing an alien culture, speaking a different language, wearing different clothes, and generally living in separate communities or sections of town. They were, in short, a marked people, natural targets for whatever passions or fears might sweep over an ignorant and superstitious population around them. Moreover, the Jews, who were typically excluded from land ownership and many other economic endeavors, often worked as middlemen, notably small tradesmen and moneylenders, and those who perform such economic functions are almost universally unpopular around the world. Where middlemen are an ethnically distinct group, the Chinese in Southeast Asia, the East Indians in Uganda, and the Igbos in Nigeria, that ethnic group is hated by the masses who deal with them. The Jews are the classic example of such a group in such occupations. It was the elite, the nobility, the kings, and the popes, who offered the Jews what small protection they received. This often had less to do with either humanitarianism or justice than with self-interest. The Jews had useful skills, and sometimes wealth. In many places, they simply had to pay the authorities for the privilege of living in the latter's domain. A change in political climate or personal caprice among the rulers could end their dearly purchased toleration at any time. The Jews were seldom an integral part of the community, even when they had lived in the same place for generations, or even centuries. Intermarriage remained very rare. The Jews typically lived together, and with the passing of the centuries and the rise of militant Christianity, they were forced to do so. In Poland in 1266, it was decreed that Jews shall not live among the Christians, but should have their homes near or next to one another in some sequestered part of the state or town. And this separate section separated from the common dwelling place of the Christians by a hedge, a wall, or a ditch. This and similar provisions in various countries evolved into the classic Jewish ghetto, walled in and with gates that were locked at night. This institution lasted for about 4 centuries. In many parts of Europe, Jews were not safe outside the ghetto. Depending upon local circumstances, they might work outside during the day, sometimes at profitable or occasionally prestigious tasks, but all their personal lives and social relationships were within the ghetto. The Jewish community was a separate, self-governing entity with its own culture, courts, and tax collections. The Jewish culture and its values were a pervasive influence on the individual, whose identity was that of a Jew, whether he lived in Italy, Poland, or France. Among the genetic consequences of these small, inbred societies was an unusual amount of physical and mental defects. The ghetto precluded an agricultural life for most European Jews. They were urbanized centuries before reaching New York and other American cities. In those parts of Europe where Jews were most isolated, the modern intellectual currents of post-Renaissance Europe largely passed them by, and their culture remained a folk culture of an earlier era. The Jews who emigrated en masse from Eastern Europe to America were from such a folk background. The many isolated Jewish communities in Europe kept in intermittent contact with one another. Each kept alive the Jewish traditions, but largely separately. Inevitably, the slow modifications of Judaism and the Jewish culture took different forms in different places, setting the stage for internal religious differences and controversies when the different groups came together later in America. Refugees from various kinds of persecution brought international contact among the Jews of Europe. In this way arose Yiddish, a German dialect with Hebrew and Polish modifications. One of the classic features of European Jewish culture was respect and reverence for learning. This was primarily religious learning, knowledge of the Talmud, and careful, minute analysis of its meanings or implications. Mothers wanted their daughters to marry learned men, even if they were poor. Most of the Jewish immigrants who moved to the United States did not have much education, and many were illiterate, but their affinity for education was extremely high. The Jews were also skilled workers, and many were small tradesmen, moneylenders, and a few large merchants and bankers. In some countries, Jews became tax collectors and other government officials and advisors. Association with political power holders brought some individual or group protection, but it also made Jews hated by enemies of the regime, and especially likely to become targets in the event of its overthrow. Among the Jewish patterns in Europe that were later to become important in America were cleanliness, philanthropy, and a very low rate of alcoholism. Public baths were an institution among Jews at a time when individual indoor plumbing was virtually unknown. Charity was also a long-established religious tradition among the Jews of Europe, even in their poverty, and large-scale philanthropy was destined to become a Jewish tradition under more prosperous conditions in America. Ironically so, in view of the stereotype of Jewish miserliness. In much of Europe, for much of history, dangers of popular resentment made it highly inadvisable for Jews to display any wealth or even evidence of prosperity, and the need to be ready to flee if necessary made it inadvisable to keep whatever they accumulated in immobile forms, such as clothes or home furnishings, and more sensible to have it in gold or jewelry. Like the Italians, Jews served wine with meals, but seldom became drunkards. Drunkenness, boisterousness, or recklessness induced by drink could easily have become fatal in the precarious situation of most European Jews. After the passage of many centuries, some of the many restrictions against Jews began to be relaxed or eliminated in the modern world. A wider development of commerce, industry, and banking made the Jew less anachronistic than in feudal society, as well as making his skills and experience in these areas more valuable. The 18th century saw political rights extended to Jews in England, France, and Holland. And in the early 19th century, other European nations began to remove legal disabilities. The spread of the French pattern with the Napoleonic conquests emancipated Jews in various parts of Europe, but the eventual defeat of Napoleon marked a retrogression for them in many places. Massacres and expulsions erupted again. Still, the political emancipation of Jews progressed across Europe in an uneven pattern from country to country. The first Jew sat in the British Parliament in 1858, but the last ghetto was not destroyed in Italy until 1885. Where the restrictions on Jews were most relaxed, in Western Europe, more cultural and even biological assimilation occurred. Distinctions of dress and hairstyles tended to disappear. The Jews began to speak the language of their respective countries and to become acquainted with its literature and philosophy. Judaism itself adapted more to the outward rituals of Christianity, with such things as organs in the house of worship, mixed choirs, stained glass windows, and services on Sunday instead of Saturday. This Reform Judaism originated in Germany, one of the more liberal countries in its policies toward Jews. Orthodox Judaism remained dominant in Russia and Eastern Europe, where the Jews remained a more separate and still restricted people. In the West, individuals of known Jewish ancestry could live as non-Jews in a Gentile world. Among the notable 19th century examples were Benjamin Disraeli, David Ricardo, and Karl Marx. While the first professional Jew entered the British Parliament in 1858, Ricardo had sat in Parliament in 1819, and Disraeli entered it in 1837. Neither was passing in the sense of concealing his ancestry, but both lived as Christians among other Christians. Similarly, Karl Marx, although descended from rabbis on both sides of his family, was the son of a convert to Christianity and was baptized a Lutheran. Marx never considered himself a Jew and always spoke of Jews in the third person. Even for those who remained in the Judaic religion, in the more liberal Western nations, this did not imply a separate existence or a denationalization. They could be seen as Frenchmen, Germans, or Hollanders of the Jewish faith. In Eastern Europe, being a Jew was much more of a total separate identity with different forms of worship and dress. In short, there were profound social and even religious differences between the Jews of Western Europe and those of Eastern Europe in the 19th century, when immigration to America began on a large scale. Jewish immigrants to America. Sephardic Jews. The first group of Jews who arrived in colonial America were Sephardic Jews, with their own religious rites, distinguished from those of the Ashkenazic Jews of the rest of Europe, and a social history in Spain and Portugal that was generally more favorable than elsewhere. In Spain and Portugal, Jews were not confined to ghettos, and some were even major landowners, political figures, bankers, and industrialists, and they dominated the liberal professions, although most were craftsmen, small shopkeepers, moneylenders, and the like. The history of Jews in the Iberian Peninsula was not, however, wholly free of the persecutions and sporadic massacres that marked their history elsewhere. During the rule of the Visigoths from the 6th to the 8th century, the position of Jews changed back and forth under successive kings, sometimes accepted and prospering at the highest levels of government, and at other times expelled from the government and even forced to flee the country. However, later Spanish monarchies provided protection for Jews while utilizing their skills in the governmental apparatus and benefiting from their economic activity in general. The first Jews to come to colonial America did so as a result of events set in motion in the very year Columbus discovered the hemisphere. After centuries of living under much more tolerant and prosperous conditions than Jews in any other parts of Europe, the Jews in Spain were suddenly expelled from the country by royal decree in 1492. Complex internal political considerations were behind this massive expulsion, and the Jews who left sought many destinations. Some were on boats in the harbor at Seville when Columbus sailed past them out to sea to find a new route to India. Some who became converts to Christianity to escape persecution were among the crews of Columbus's ships. Indeed, part of the voyage was financed with money confiscated by the government from the expelled Jews. After having been forced to help pay for the discovery of America, it was perhaps fitting that more Jews were later settled in the United States than in any other country in the world, more even than in Israel. Many of the expelled Jews settled first in nearby Portugal, but others went to Holland or other places of refuge. The large Sephardic community in Amsterdam helped to make Little Holland a major international commercial and financial power. Portugal eventually forced many Jews out, after taking much of their wealth by various devices. Changing political forces elsewhere, for example, the change in Brazil's status from a Dutch colony to a Portuguese colony, forced the Sephardic Jews to continue moving. By the 17th century, British policy in the American colonies permitted Jews greater freedom than in most of the rest of the world. The first synagogue in North America was established in New York in 1695. Although the wealth of the Sephardic Jews was often exhausted or confiscated by the time they had reached colonial America, the skills that had produced this wealth recreated it in America. All in all, there were about 2,000 Jews in the colonies at the time of the American Revolution. Most were Sephardic and by now prosperous, and they maintained an attitude of exclusiveness and a hauteur toward other American Jews who were Ashkenazic. A Sephardic Jew who married an Ashkenazic Jew risked being disowned by his family. The two groups of Jews were also rigidly separate in Holland and in England, although their religious rites differed only in details. Centuries of separation in different countries had made them socially different, although adherents of the same religion. In modern times, in both the United States and Israel, Sephardic Jews do not average as high IQs as Ashkenazic Jews. Historically, Sephardic Jews were never as oriented toward scholarship as other Jews, but were highly successful in business. They were more worldly in a world that offered them more opportunities than other contemporary Jews had in other countries. German Jews. German Jews entered colonial America shortly after the Sephardic Jews. When they were only a trickle, German Jews tended to enter the existing Jewish communities and adapt to the Sephardic rites. As the German Jewish element grew larger, they separated to form their own communities and built their own temples of the Ashkenazic rites, and particularly Reform Judaism. The later arriving German Jews, especially in the 19th century, were not merely newer immigrants, but poorer and less acculturated and from a more provincial background in the smaller towns of Germany. They were socially very different from the older Sephardic Jews, who were by now very well established and prosperous in America. The emigration of Jews from Germany greatly changed the size of the American Jewish community, as well as its internal composition. There had been less than 3,000 Jews in the American colonies in 1776, but this increased between 4 and 5 times by 1820. By 1850, they were estimated to be about 10 times that number. By 1880, the Jewish population had increased another 10 times to over 500,000. The bulk of this was due to emigration from Germany. Unlike the Sephardic Jews before them, or the Eastern European Jews after them, the German Jews did not concentrate in a few communities. They spread out through the young American nation, working as small tradesmen and professionals scattered among their non-Jewish clientele. Some settled among German farmers in Pennsylvania. Some settled in the Midwest, often among other Germans. Others followed the wagons to the western frontier. The heavy denim trousers called Levi's were named after one of these German Jewish peddlers, Levi Strauss. In the desperate loneliness of many rural and frontier areas, the Jewish peddler was a welcome visitor. It was one of many contrasts with Jewish experience in Europe. Yankee peddlers had gone before them, so Americans were accustomed to such itinerant merchants, with their miscellaneous combs, scissors, needles, and threads. Among the early German Jewish peddlers, it was common to travel with a peddler's pack on one's back, and only later did the more successful move up to horse and buggy. Some peddlers eventually settled down and opened local stores. Many of the great wealthy Jewish families began in America as peddlers. The Guggenheims, the Gimbels, and the Altmans, for example. By the middle of the 19th century, Jews were an accepted part of American life, and most were German Jews. By the time of the Civil War, there were more than 50 synagogues in New York alone. There were also numerous Jewish civic and philanthropic organizations. The German Jews were active not only in their own communities, but also in American society at large as businessmen and bankers. The large credit rating agency of R.G. Dunn found 374 Jewish firms worthy of a commercial rating in 1860, and 1,714 by 1870. Many Jews were destined to play important roles in developing such major American institutions as Macy's department store chain, Sears Roebuck, and the New York Times. As of 1880, 40% of all the German Jewish families had at least one servant. Only 1% of the heads of Jewish families were still peddlers, and fewer than 1% worked as laborers or domestic servants. In a sense, American Jews had arrived. In another sense, numerically, they had not yet begun to arrive. The great massive immigration of Eastern European Jews began in the 1880s, the coming of the ancestors of most Jewish Americans today. Eastern European Jews. During the 13th and 14th centuries, the Polish royalty encouraged Jews to settle in their country and issued charters to protect them. The Jews were vehicles by which skills and knowledge from the more advanced parts of Europe could be brought into Poland. Jews in Poland were allowed more freedom and community autonomy than most contemporary Jews elsewhere, and were not locked in ghettos, although they typically lived together under Talmudic law. As the artisans and merchants progressed over the centuries among the poor illiterate peasants, they were resented and hated by them and by their church religious leaders. The fact that Jews worked as tax collectors for the government and collected rents for landlords brought more hatred against them. Depending on changing political fortunes, Jews were protected or persecuted by the authorities. Much of the area where Jews lived in Europe was taken over by Russia in the 18th century. There had been very few Jews in Russia before this, and the Russians confined the Jews to their former place of settlement in the lands newly acquired from Poland. Catherine the Great in 1791 established an area called the Jewish Pale of Settlement. Few Jews were permitted to move beyond the Pale. Many of the rights formerly enjoyed by Jews in Poland were taken away by the Russians. Successive czars followed changing policies toward the Jews, some recognizing the value of their skills, others being more concerned with their religious and social differences from the other Russians. In the 19th century, brutal attempts were made to Russify the Jews, taking their boys away at age 12 or earlier for 6 years of training in Greek Orthodox schools, followed by the 25 years of military service to which all Russian males were subject. Desperate evasions were used by the Jews, including even maiming their children. Equally drastic methods were used by the Russians, including sending kidnappers at large to capture children they might chance upon. Eventually, the law was changed under Tsar Nicholas II, who also freed the serfs. But with the assassination of the Tsar in 1881, a new round of violently anti-Jewish laws was issued by his son. Compounding the anti-Semitic policies of the new Tsar were widespread riots and peasant massacres of Jews throughout the region of the Pale. Mobs rampaged through the Jewish areas, destroying, looting, raping, and murdering. Even children and infants were not spared. With these tragic events began one of the great human migrations in history. Over the next 4 decades, 2 million people, 1/3 of all the Jews in Eastern Europe, moved to the United States. During those years, 3/4 of all the people who left Russia for the United States were Jews, and 3/4 of the Jews who arrived in the United States were from Russia. In addition to those who emigrated directly from Russia, there were many Jews who escaped to become refugees in other European countries, and only later moved to America, often with the help of Jewish philanthropic organizations or relatives in America. The overwhelming majority of these Jewish immigrants came to stay. The rate of return migration was lower among Jews than among any other large group of immigrants. About half the Jews in 19th century Russia were literate, roughly 2/3 of the men and 1/3 of the women. This was much higher than for the Russian population as a whole. Jews were also far more urbanized. Less than 3% were in agricultural occupations, while more than 30% were in commerce, nearly 40% in mining and manufacturing, and 5% worked in professional occupations. Almost half of all Russian Jews worked in some aspect of clothes production. The mass immigration era. The Eastern European Jews began arriving in the United States in huge numbers in the 1880s. In that decade, more than 200,000 immigrated to America, followed by 300,000 in the 1890s and about 1.5 million from the turn of the century to the beginning of World War I. The size of the Eastern European Jewish immigration swamped the existing American Jewish community of largely German origin. The Eastern European Jews were also heavily concentrated in New York City, and in fact were even more localized on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which contained the largest number of Jews ever assembled in one place on Earth in thousands of years. The German Jews already established in America were appalled, not only by the number, but also by the way of life of most of the Eastern European Jews. The Eastern Jews were not only poorer, most arrived destitute, with less money than any other immigrant group, but were also far less educated, a 50% illiteracy rate, and with rougher manners than the more sophisticated and Americanized German Jews. Eastern European Jews had lived a provincial life outside the mainstream of the general European culture in which German Jews were immersed. Eastern Europeans even looked different. Earlocks, skull caps, beards, old-fashioned Russian-style clothing, scarves about the women's heads, and a general demeanor reminiscent of a painful past that German Jews had long ago left behind. The Orthodox Jewish religious services were full of traditions and practices long abandoned by the modern Reform Judaism of Germans. The very language of the Eastern European Jews, Yiddish, was a folk dialect disdained by more educated Jews who used either the language of the country or classical Hebrew. In short, the Eastern European Jews were an acute embarrassment to the German Jews in America. Their numbers, ways, and concentration made them highly visible, alarming other Americans and threatening an anti-Semitic reaction that would harm the German Jews who had quietly gained acceptance before. The Jewish press, controlled by German Jews, was openly critical of the new immigrants, whom they described as representing Oriental antiquity, speaking a piggish jargon, and slovenly in dress, loud in manners, and vulgar in discourse. Their religion was referred to as medieval orthodoxy. The vicissitudes of the Eastern European Jews were seen by the German Jews as filling the newspapers with daily records of misdemeanors, marital miseries, and petty quarrels. It was the German Jews who coined the epithet Kaik to apply to Eastern European Jews. Overriding all of these antipathies, however, was the Jewish philanthropic tradition. German Jewish organizations made strenuous efforts to aid and especially to Americanize the Eastern European Jewish immigrants. Schools, libraries, hospitals, and community centers were established to serve downtown Jews, financed by uptown Jews. Yet even these humanitarian endeavors carried over some of these intergroup tensions. For example, even after 90% of the patients at New York's Mount Sinai Hospital were Eastern Europeans, no Eastern European physicians were admitted to the hospital staff. Religious services at People's Synagogue were conducted wholly in Hebrew and German, and Yiddish was taboo. As a contemporary wrote, "In the philanthropic institutions of our aristocratic German Jews, you see beautiful offices, desks, all decorated, but strict and angry faces. Every poor man is questioned like a criminal, is looked down upon. Every unfortunate suffers self-degradation and shivers like a leaf, just as if he was standing before a Russian official." As soon as their financial condition permitted, Eastern European Jews began to establish their own philanthropic organizations. These began to arise by the late 1880s. One of these organizations proclaimed, "In dispensing money and matzos to the poor, all are recognized as the children of one father, and no lines are drawn between natives of different countries." Although the terms uptown German Jews and downtown Russian Jews were peculiar to New York City, the divisions they symbolized were not. In mid-19th century Chicago, the German Jews regarded the Polish Jews as an inferior caste. A Chicago rabbi, in appealing for funds for the United Hebrew Relief Association, lamented that the Jews in Chicago were divided by pecuniary, intellectual, and social distinctions, provincial jealousies, and even religious distinctions and differences, and asked of the new immigrants, "Are they less poor? Are they less Israelites, because Poland or Russia is the land in which they first saw the light, or rather the darkness, of this world?" While the appeal was successful in financial terms, still the German Jews who contributed looked down with pity, benevolently to be sure, but with a certain condescension, upon their Russian and Polish co-religionists. As in New York, the German Jews in Chicago ran philanthropic organizations whose clienteles were Eastern European Jews. As in New York, the Eastern European Jews resented the way they were treated and began setting up their own charitable organizations. The Jewish immigrants brought with them the hunted look of the Pale, and seldom ventured beyond their own streets. They lacked self-confidence and presence in dealing with others, and were often unable to communicate with strangers, even American Jews who did not speak Yiddish. Walking with bent heads, the ghetto crouch, and obviously fearful and unresisting, they were natural targets for street bullies who insulted and harassed them, or casually pulled their beards. Their passivity under provocation only increased the German Jews' resentment of them for letting Gentiles think that Jews were cowards. But the German Jews, who had been safely prospering in America, had never experienced anything like the horrors still vivid to the Eastern European immigrants. Between the Eastern European Jews and German Jews, there long remained caste-like divisions. For example, in Philadelphia in 1940, the Jewish upper class was still almost entirely German in ethnic origins. In New York, uptown Jews seldom married downtown Jews. In Chicago, Russian Jews built up their own separate community life, and intermarriage among the various nationalities of Jews long remained almost as rare as intermarriage between ghetto Jews and Gentiles. The so-called overprotective Jewish mother came out of the Eastern European background. Her desire to always have her children around her, within her sight, is all too understandable in view of the Jewish experience in Eastern Europe, where Jewish children who wandered off might never be seen again. In Eastern Europe, even Jewish children who lived near the woods seldom went swimming or fishing or walked in the forest. The life pattern of centuries was not readily broken in America. Anti-Semitism in the United States assumed growing and unprecedented proportions in the last quarter of the 19th century, with the mass arrival of the Eastern European Jews. German Jews were hard hit by this, as many were financially in a position to be eligible for exclusive social clubs, posh hotels, and other benefits and honors denied them by reason of their religion, and the immigration of their newly arrived co-religionists. At less Olympian levels, help wanted ads began to specify Christians, as they had once specified Protestant to exclude the Irish. Economic conditions. The immigrant generation of Jews flooded into the Lower East Side of Manhattan at the same time as the massive influx of Italian immigrants, helping create one of the most crowded communities on the face of the earth. In a pattern repeated many times with many groups in American history, the initial middle-class inhabitants, German and Irish at this time, began to withdraw as the poverty-stricken newcomers moved in. Eventually, 1/6 of New York's total population lived here, on 1/82nd of its land. By the turn of the century, the Lower East Side averaged more than 700 people per acre, more than in the worst slums of Bombay. A contemporary described the Lower East Side as the eyesore of New York, the filthiest place in the Western continent. Not only were families crowded into small quarters, they often took in roomers and boarders to help them pay the rent. Even so, large-scale evictions for non-payment of rent were common. More than 10,000 in 1 year in just 2 judicial districts on the Lower East Side. One indication of the economic conditions of Eastern European immigrant Jews at this time was that a proposal to require each new immigrant to have $25 in cash with him before being admitted to the United States sent alarm and anger throughout the Lower East Side Jewish community. Most of them had not had 1/3 of this much when they arrived in America. The immigrant Jews typically worked in manual occupations, ranging from casual laborers who gathered on street corners early each morning, hoping to be hired by somebody for a day's work, to skilled craftsmen working at their respective trades. The occupational range of the immigrants was limited by their own religious and social constraints. Unlike the German Jews before them, the Eastern European immigrant Jews could not readily spread out across the nation, or even across the city. Their religious orthodoxy restricted their ability to work in factories at a time when factories often worked on Saturdays, the Sabbath observed by Orthodox Jews. Their language differences also made it difficult for them to work or live among other Americans, as did their need for kosher food and a synagogue. In short, they needed to live and work among other Jews to a far greater extent than German Jews had at a similar stage. The German Jews had been less religiously and culturally self-restricted, and had never had an enduring all-Jewish neighborhood in New York, such as now existed in a large area of the Lower East Side. For all their poverty, Jews seldom became servants. In New York City, in 1880, about half of all Irish and Italians were working in personal service, and even 21% of the Germans, but less than 4% of the Jews. Yet Jewish women did not simply remain home as housewives. Home was the site of much work, contracted from businessmen and performed by all members of the family, including small children. These were the famous sweatshops of the Lower East Side tenements, where whirring sewing machines behind closed doors could be heard on every floor. Jews had been concentrated in clothing production in Eastern Europe and in America. They arrived just as the mass production, ready-made clothing industry was developing. As late as 1880, less than half of the men's clothing in the United States was ready-to-wear clothing. Homemade or tailor-made clothing was the rule, and a large market existed for second-hand clothing. Isaac M. Singer's perfection and promotion of the sewing machine changed that almost overnight. By 1885, there were 241 garment factories in New York City, 234 of which were owned by Jews. These were mostly German Jews, with Eastern European Jews as their employees. In a familiar pattern of group succession, a generation later, the Eastern European Jews would be employers in the garment industry, with Italians and others as their employees. New York was destined to remain the center of the American clothing industry, and Jews predominated among its businessmen. As of 1890, about half of all Jews working in American industry were clothing workers. While the 19th century home sweatshop was the bane of reformers then and historians later, it provided a way for Jewish women to work without leaving their children unattended, and a way for people with no knowledge of English and a reluctance to leave their own neighborhoods to earn a living nevertheless. It had its costs: long hours in cramped quarters, often sacrifice of opportunities for their children to get schooling, and all for wages that were below even the standards of the time. The frequent charge of exploitation, however, overlooks the fact that the subcontractor, or sweater, for whom the immigrants worked, frequently worked long hours himself for a relatively small profit. It was essentially a system by which the mass of Americans obtained brand new clothing at a price they could afford. The Jewish sweatshop workers were, by contemporary accounts, able to save a substantial portion of their earnings, providing for the future economic rise of themselves and their children. In view of their later success, it would be arrogant of others to claim that they were not making the best of their meager opportunities. Over half of all the Jewish immigrants worked in manual occupations, and even the white-collar occupations included many pushcart peddlers. Between 1880 and 1905, the number of peddlers in New York City increased by 75%, largely due to Jewish immigrants, about 10% of whom were peddlers at one time, although many more passed through that stage during their adjustment to American life. Other white-collar occupations included butcher, baker, and grocer. Only about 5% of the immigrant Jews worked in high white-collar occupations, and as late as the turn of the century, only about 1% of the Jewish immigrants were professionals. 2/3 of all Jews were skilled workers, however. Social conditions. While the Jews experienced poverty and slum living, their own peculiar culture and values enabled them to escape some of the long-run consequences. They lived in overcrowded fire traps and were struck hard by tuberculosis, but alcoholism never became a serious problem among them, and their traditional concern for cleanliness spared them some of the other diseases that struck some other slum dwellers. Physically, the Eastern European Jewish immigrants were small and were described by contemporaries as physical wrecks, and among the most stunted of the Europeans. Part of this may have been a result of their poverty, and of traditional Jewish de-emphasis of the physical in favor of the mental. It may also have been a genetic result of centuries of inbreeding in small enclaves, which would also explain its disappearance among later generations born in the much larger Jewish communities in America. Yet, for all their apparent physical disadvantages, Jews had lower death rates than others, often lower than those in more prosperous neighborhoods. One factor was their traditional emphasis on cleanliness, whether religiously based or evolved from centuries of urban living in Europe. Public bathhouses were a tradition among Eastern European Jews and were recreated in New York. By 1897, over half the bathhouses in New York City were Jewish. Individual home bathtubs were virtually unknown on the East Side at this time. An indoor water faucet, or water toilet, to be shared by many tenants, was a recent improvement and by no means universal. There were still thousands of outdoor toilets in the backyards. Within these severe limits, immigrant Jews tried to maintain traditions of cleanliness. Their success must be measured within this context and compared to other slum dwellers, although they were faulted on this score by their middle-class contemporaries. The Jews did not suffer the cholera epidemics that had decimated the Irish neighborhoods in various cities decades earlier, but there were obvious limits to cleanliness in an area with about 300 bathtubs among 250,000 hard-working people. Religious rules regulating the handling and preparation of kosher food also had sanitary effects. Neither the people nor the food always fulfilled the highest standards of cleanliness. German Jews pointedly included lessons on soap and water in their programs for Eastern European Jews, but everything is relative. Health and cleanliness were more characteristic of Jews than of other city slum dwellers. Similarly, such scourges as tuberculosis, venereal disease, and desertions of families by fathers appeared among the Lower East Side Jews in alarming amounts compared to what they had been used to in the more stable communities they knew in Europe, but usually were well below the level of other slum dwellers. Alcohol was never the problem among Jews that it was among other groups. Their rates of alcoholism have remained among the lowest in America. While the Lower East Side contained less than 20% of New York's population, it suffered almost 40% of its deaths from fire. Closely packed tenements readily communicated fire, and the overcrowding of people and furniture, often even in the halls and on fire escapes, made escape or rescue difficult in an emergency. A 1908 survey showed that less than 1/10 of the East Side families slept less than 2 to a room. About half slept 3 or 4 to a room, and more than 1/3 slept 5 or more to a room. What has been most striking about the Jews has been their attitude toward education. Although very few of the Eastern European Jews were well educated, about half were not even literate on arrival, they came from a culture where learning had been revered for centuries. The learned man, or even a well-schooled child, earned respect in the community. Free schools and free public libraries in New York were seized upon by children and adults alike. A survey of public libraries in the Russian Jewish tenement neighborhoods in New York in 1912 showed that 53% of the books borrowed were nonfiction, and that the bulk of the fictional works were by such authors as Tolstoy, Dumas, and Dickens. Frothy bestsellers remained dusty on the shelves. Most of the people in these neighborhoods were manual workers, skilled but manual, and even those statistically categorized as white-collar were often pushcart peddlers, butchers, grocers, or in other occupations where book learning was of no economic value. Yet they not only read, but went to all sorts of public lectures on topics far from relevant to their daily lives. As one contemporary later observed, "You can imagine how badly we needed Herbert Spencer on Delancey Street in those days." Jewish immigrant children worked in the sweatshops and elsewhere, but seldom full-time, because of their parents' desire for them to go to school. In the schools, the teachers were usually Irish, seldom Jewish, and the classrooms were overcrowded. In the late 1880s, it was estimated that there were 87 pupils per teacher in the lowest primary grade, and even so, thousands of children were refused admission due to lack of space. Even around the turn of the century, classes of 60 sitting 3 to a seat were not unusual. Earlier figures for pupils per teacher in mid-century New York were even higher during the period of Irish immigration. A number of Lower East Side schools were over 90% Jewish. Attempts to relieve overcrowding in these schools by busing these children to West Side schools in Irish neighborhoods provoked protest meetings and irate editorials in the Jewish newspapers. The plans were abandoned. While some teachers spoke glowingly of the Lower East Side Jewish children, others found teaching them to be unusually tedious, and observed that many come from families in which English is seldom spoken at all, and where good manners and cleanliness are decidedly at a discount. Much may depend on whether the East Side Jews were being compared with other slum dwellers or with middle-class contemporaries. A sympathetic Irish schoolteacher from the Lower East Side wrote fictional stories about the area in which both pictures of Jewish school children appear, at times eager to please and at other times a howling mob of little savages. The teacher heroine of the stories delivered daily lectures on personal grooming and hygiene, in which her discussions of soap and water became almost personal in tone. The remarkable achievements, especially intellectual achievements, of later generations of Jews cannot simply be read back into the immigrant generation. These children often had serious educational problems. A 1910 survey of a dozen cities found 2/3 of the children of Polish Jews to be below the normal grade for their age. This was an era when it was common to avoid promoting children until their scholastic performance merited it. But even so, the record of Polish Jews was worse than others. A 1911 study showed that 41% of the 5,431 Russian Jewish children surveyed were behind the normal grade level. Partly this may be because so many entered school late due to overcrowded New York schools that annually turned many away. However, even among the Russian Jewish children who entered at age 6, 23% were behind their normal grade level, about the same as for the New York City school system as a whole, where most were presumably enrolled. As late as World War I, soldiers of Russian, mostly Jewish, origin averaged among the lowest mental test scores of any of the ethnic groups tested by the U.S. Army. These results led a leading contemporary authority on tests to declare that this disproved the popular belief that the Jew is highly intelligent. Like so many confident expert conclusions, this one failed to stand the test of time. Later generations. The upward movement of American Jews across broad economic, intellectual, social, and political areas was unprecedented and unparalleled. Between 1897 and 1907, the number of Jewish physicians in Manhattan rose from 450 to 1,000, pharmacists from 45 to 115, and dentists from 59 to 350. These were still small proportions of the hundreds of thousands of Jews on the Lower East Side of New York. However, it indicates something of a general trend. A broader picture shows the proportions of New York Jews in high white-collar occupations rising from 5% in 1880 to 15% in 1905. Peddling declined by 75%. Even among those Jews who began as manual laborers in Boston, only about half were still manual laborers at the end of their careers. Their upward mobility was double that among other groups. By the middle of the 20th century, 20% of Jewish males were professionals, double the national average, and 35% more were proprietors, compared to 13% for the U.S. population as a whole. Most Jews were white-collar workers, while most other Americans were still blue-collar workers at that time. As the Jews rose economically, they also spread out residentially. The younger generation was English-speaking, often bilingual, and so was less tied to the Lower East Side by Old World language and culture. The building of the New York subway system in the early 20th century made Uptown, notably Harlem and the Bronx, more accessible to workplaces than before. Both became heavily settled with Jews. The more Americanized Jews also found other parts of the United States more accessible than their immigrant parents had. New York, however, still remained the center of the Eastern European settlement. But whereas 3/4 of the city's Jews had lived on the Lower East Side in 1892, this proportion had dropped to half by 1903 and to only 23% by 1916. By 1930, there were more Jews living in Brooklyn than in Manhattan, and by 1940, both Brooklyn and the Bronx had at least twice as many Jews as Manhattan. By mid-century, among the 5 boroughs of New York, only Staten Island had fewer Jews than Manhattan, their original stronghold. The similar residential changes occurred in Chicago. The west side of Chicago was the original settlement area of Eastern European Jews. The portion of the west side slum that was Jewish differed from the rest of that section of Chicago only in having far fewer saloons. In 1931, almost half of the Jews in Chicago still lived on the west side, but by 1958, only 6% were still there, while most were living in the more prosperous north side of Chicago. Nationally, more than half of all American Jews continued to live in the northeastern United States, on past the mid-century mark. New York City alone contained 40% of all the Jews in the United States. The proportion of Jews living in the Midwest and South declined, while the proportion of all Jews who lived in the West more than doubled, and those living specifically on the Pacific Coast quadrupled between 1900 and 1968, from 3% to 12%. Jews rose to have not only higher incomes than other Americans, but also more education and higher IQs. By the middle of the 20th century, more than 1/4 of all Jewish males had 4 or more years of college, while less than 10% of the U.S. population as a whole had that much education. The incomes of Jewish males were 36% higher than those of American males in general. Various studies show Jews now have higher IQs than other Americans. More than 1/4 of all Nobel Prizes won by all Americans have been won by Jewish Americans, who are only 3% of the population. Jews became prominent among American writers, scientists, motion picture producers, and millionaires. The Jewish Lower East Side of New York also produced notable boxers, entertainers, union leaders, journalists, and criminals, such as neighborhoods have typically done with other groups. Fanny Brice, Jack Benny, the Marx Brothers, Milton Berle, and Danny Kaye have been among the many comedians who are Jewish. Side note, David Daniel Kaminsky was his name. Among the Jewish movie moguls were Samuel Goldwyn and Louis B. Mayer, whose names were incorporated into the initials for MGM Studios. David O. Selznick, the Warner Brothers, and William Fox were others. 2 of the most distinguished newspapers in New York history, in very different ways, were founded or developed by Jews. The Jewish Daily Forward was the first daily newspaper written in the long-disdained Yiddish dialect and was a major influence in the lives of Eastern European Jews in New York. Its circulation grew to 20,000 in 1900 and to more than 130,000 by 1918. It was, and remained for decades, the largest Yiddish-language newspaper in the world. The New York Times became an internationally famous institution after being bought by Adolf Ochs in 1896. Joseph Pulitzer, who was half Jewish, developed the St. Louis Dispatch and the New York World and established the Pulitzer Prize. In the arts, Joschka Heifetz and Nathan Milstein became leading American violinists of their time, and Artur Rubinstein was one of the leading classical pianists. George Gershwin created a unique musical idiom out of his classical training and the music of the Negroes whom he lived near as he grew up. Irving Berlin and Eddie Cantor came out of New York's Lower East Side. In science and medicine, Albert Einstein, J. Robert Oppenheimer, and Jonas Salk are perhaps the best known of the many Jewish Americans who achieved distinction in these fields. In economics, Milton Friedman, Paul Samuelson, and Simon Kuznets were Nobel Prize winners. Among the literary figures, Lillian Hellman, Arthur Miller, J.D. Salinger, and Saul Bellow are part of a very long list of Jewish contributors to American letters. In the legal profession, such names as Brandeis, Frankfurter, and Cardozo are part of a larger Jewish pattern that has been characterized as from rags to robes. While the Jewish passion for education has been evident and a factor in the rise of many leading individuals and crucial for whole professions, it can be overemphasized as a factor in their initial rise from the slums. The initial stages of the rise of the Eastern European Jews were apparent by the turn of the century, at a time when no Jewish child had graduated from a public high school in New York City. The first graduating class from a New York City public high school was in 1902. As of 1908, 16% of Jewish youngsters graduated from high school, and although that was well in excess of such groups as the Irish or the Italians, it could hardly explain the rise of the other 84% of Jews. Public schools and public libraries were undoubtedly very popular in the Americanization of the Eastern European Jews, and this in turn opened the doors that would have otherwise remained closed. But it was not as scholars or intellectuals that most of the immigrant Jews rose in America. Even among the millionaire movie moguls, theirs was by no means the life of cultured intellectuals. Instead, they have often been described as vulgar, crude, and overbearing. After the first generation of Jews rose out of the immigrant slums, they could afford to send their children off to college, and did so to a greater extent than other Americans. But higher education was the consequence of an already achieved prosperity, not the cause of it for most Jews. Free municipal colleges in New York were a godsend to a people with the Jewish intellectual tradition, and not yet wealthy enough to afford comparable other colleges. But these municipal colleges became predominantly Jewish only after upward mobility was underway. The most famous of these schools, City College in New York, had only 11% Eastern European Jews among its alumni for classes graduating in the early 1920s. It was not until the 1930s that the Eastern European element became one half of City College's graduates. Among the Jewish graduates in the early part of the century, most were German Jews. Similarly, at New York's Hunter College in 1906, only about a fourth of the graduates were Jews, and most of these were German Jews, with less than 10% of the Hunter graduates being Eastern European Jews. Many Jewish youngsters were working even before reaching college age. In 1880, 38% of the clothing workers in New York City were teenage Jews. In 1914 to 15, 37% of all working papers issued to teenagers in New York City went to Jewish teenagers. The patterns of Jewish success in America, to a large extent, followed the patterns of skills, habits, and orientation that had existed in Eastern Europe. The prevalence of occupational skills among the Jewish immigrants ultimately meant more than their almost total lack of money. The industry in which their skills were concentrated, clothing manufacturing, absorbed a substantial part of all Jewish labor and provided the basis for many Jews to move up to become owners of their own businesses. The long Jewish tradition of respect for education influenced Jewish youngsters to continue in school, and this helped not only those few who went on to higher education, but also those for whom 8 years of schooling was a ticket to white-collar jobs at the time, and still others who were simply enabled to move more easily in an American society that still remained foreign to their parents. The few areas of lesser success or actual failure also reflect the Jewish tradition and experience before reaching America. This most successful of all American ethnic groups was repeatedly a failure in agricultural ventures in various parts of the United States. Like other immigrants, Jews were often encouraged by reformers to move out of the crowded city onto the land. Often it was the urban German Jews who thought that rural life was better for the Eastern European Jews. Among those few Jews who did settle on the land, their total lack of experience in agriculture became painfully apparent as their ventures all failed financially. Centuries of urban life in Europe lay behind their failures, as well as behind their many successes. In the early years, especially, Eastern European Jews were slow to have an impact in the worlds of politics and sports, areas in which they had virtually no experience in Europe. German Jews had had some political experience in America as early as the middle of the 19th century, but only a few Eastern European Jews were in politics in the early 20th century, usually in positions wholly subordinate to Irish politicians. The Eastern European Jews lacked the necessary experience, the self-assurance, and most of all, outgoingness. The Irish were well ahead of them in all these qualities as a result of their history in Ireland, and remained in control of New York City politics until at least World War II, even though New York had the largest Jewish population of any city in the world. The Jewish political thinking tended to be ideological or programmatic, socialism in its early period and liberalism later, whereas the Irish were preoccupied with getting into power, which they did very successfully. Even after the Jews managed to make a major impact in politics, it was typically through men known primarily for their substantive programs or administrative expertise, rather than their charismatic personalities. Another area into which Jews moved slowly was sports. This, too, reflected long traditions of de-emphasizing physical activity for recreation in favor of reading, chess, or playing music. Shalom Aleichem may not have been absolutely correct when he said, "The best fiddlers have always been Jews." But clearly they have been much overrepresented among the great violinists. They have been comparatively underrepresented among great athletes. Whereas the Irish quickly rose to domination in boxing and baseball, and remained dominant for decades, the first outstanding Jewish boxers appeared only around World War I, and Jewish baseball players reached the major leagues only in the 1920s, with Hank Greenberg still considered a curiosity when he appeared with the Detroit Tigers in 1933. There have been other Jewish baseball stars of the first magnitude, Al Rosen and Sandy Koufax, for example, but the total number of Jewish players remained very small compared to either the Irish or Germans before them or the blacks or Latin Americans after them. The rise of the Jews in America was by no means unopposed. While American anti-Semitism never reached the levels seen in Europe, it was still a factor in barring Jews from many positions, including the leading banks and law firms, and from the executive ranks of many large corporations. Here, too, their centuries of experience as a minority in Europe helped them. They were long familiar with barriers and knew they could be overcome or circumvented. Rather than surrender to despair or exhaust themselves in trying to reform others, the Jews found or made their own opportunities. They largely created the American clothing production industry, replacing both homemade clothes and tailor-made clothes. To a large extent, they developed the motion picture industry and created the Yiddish theater and the Borscht circuit, where Jewish entertainers could get a start before heading out into a wider world. They established their own law firms and banks. Barred from many leading universities until after World War II, they pursued scholarly careers where they could, worked in government, and created such a pool of highly educated people that it ultimately became too costly for universities to keep them off their faculties. Today, Jews are overrepresented among college and university faculty. Understanding the spectacular rise of the Jews may be useful for understanding social progress in general. It was not that they began with such presumed prerequisites as money or education. They were more destitute and illiterate than other immigrants, nor were they politically adroit, nor did the larger society accept them socially or open opportunities for them economically. Yet the internal values and traditions of the Jews were almost tailor-made for success in the American economy. The Jews came not only with specific skills, but also with a way of life adapted to centuries of urban life and commercial and industrial activity. Even when the Jews were apparently just workers like other workers, they were often workers who were the sons and grandsons of merchants and scholars, from families whose livelihoods had been destroyed by anti-Semitic policies in Russia, but who retained the experience, initiative, and confidence engendered by the earlier success. Even when the Jews lived in slums, they were slums with a difference: lower alcoholism, homicide, accidental death rates than other slums, or even the city as a whole. Their children had lower truancy rates, lower juvenile delinquency rates, and by the 1930s, higher IQs than other children. The Jews had lower infant mortalities and more organizations than other low-income people. There was also more voting for congressmen by low-income Jews than even by higher-income Protestants or Catholics. In short, the Jews had the social patterns and values of the middle class, even when they lived in the slums. Despite a voluminous literature claiming that slums shape people's values, the Jews had their own values, and they took those values into and out of the slums. In short, with Jews as well as with many other ethnic groups, neither their successes nor their handicaps can be understood solely in terms of the American context. Many of the reasons for both reached far back into history. Social conditions. The special importance of the family has been characteristic of the Jews in the United States, although the size of the family has been reduced more drastically among Jews than among other Americans. Jews are more likely to marry at some point in their lives than others, and much less likely to divorce. The rate of intermarriage of Jews with non-Jews ranged between 5 and 9% during the 1930s. By the 1950s and 1960s, intermarriage rates for Jews ranged between about 8% in New York City to 37% in Marin County, California, to more than half in Iowa. Although the Jewish intermarriage rate rose, it is still well below those of other groups. In general, Jewish intermarriage rates have tended to be higher where the Jewish community has been very small and surrounded by a much larger Gentile group. But even in as large a Jewish community as existed in New York, intermarriage rates rose. Still, these rates are not high compared to the intermarriage rates of other European origin groups. The size of the Jewish family has undergone dramatic changes over the years. Back around the turn of the century, Jewish families were larger than those of most other ethnic groups, but by mid-century, Jewish families were among the smallest. As of 1910, the average number of children per woman in their mid-30s and mid-40s was 5.3 for Jews, compared to 3.4 children for the United States as a whole. Jews had more children than blacks, the Irish, or the Italians, and the same as Mexican Americans, a perennially high fertility group. By 1969, the number of children per woman had fallen by more than one half among Jews, 2.4, compared to a national average of 3.4. The large generation of older Jews and the small generation of younger Jews has meant an average older age for Jews than for any other ethnic group. The average age of American Jews is 46, more than double the average age of blacks, Indians, Puerto Ricans, or Mexican Americans. This has helped contribute to the overrepresentation of Jews in high-level occupations, requiring experience as well as education. Despite low rates of intermarriage with other groups, Jews have historically had peaceful and even cooperative relations with other ethnic groups. This too is a pattern carried over from Europe, where needless hostilities would have been dangerous to Jewish survival. In the United States, Jews had historically peaceful relations with Germans and Italians, and have cooperated with and partially financed black civil rights organizations. While the Irish had conflicts with the Jews, as they did with other groups, Jewish employers hired Irish workers when other employers would not, although Irish employers generally did not reciprocate by hiring Jewish employees. Jews have historically offered less resistance when blacks moved into their neighborhoods. Harlem was a predominantly Jewish community in the early 20th century. Politically, Jews have historically tended to adopt, or at least to be responsive to, the viewpoint of the underdog, long after that ceased to be their own position economically. Socialism and liberalism have been dominant political themes among American Jews. The early socialism, anarchism, and unionism of Jewish immigrants gave way to a generalized liberalism as Jews moved up out of the working class and into the middle class, although Jews continued to be overrepresented among radicals. Back in the 19th century, when the Republican Party was considered to be more liberal than the Democratic Party, Jews were Republicans, supporters of Lincoln, for example. Jews continued to vote Republican into the 1920s, although Woodrow Wilson had captured their vote in 1916. In 1920s, there were 11 Jewish congressmen, 10 Republicans, and 1 socialist. But in 1922, for the first time in the 20th century, there were more Jewish Democrats than Republicans elected to Congress. By 1940, 90% of American Jews voted for the Democratic presidential candidate, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and did so again in 1944, and again in 1948 when Truman ran. The lowest that the Jewish vote for the Democratic presidential candidates has ever been over the next 20 years was 60% in 1956. The party switch of the Jews largely coincided with a change in the parties themselves in regard to liberalism and conservatism. Blacks made a similar switch at about the same time. A survey of Jews in New York found 3/4 to be registered Democrats, and half described themselves as liberal, and just over 1/4 described themselves as moderate. Other Americans in the Jews' income brackets tended to be more conservative and Republican. This would be difficult to explain purely on the basis of the Jewish experience in America, in particular their spectacular economic rise, but much more understandable against the background of centuries of Jewish religious tradition of taking care of their own poor and their general role as a persecuted minority throughout Europe. Jewish candidates often do well with Jewish voters, but usually both are liberal, and non-Jewish liberals also do well among these voters. Hubert Humphrey won a higher percentage of the Jewish vote than Arthur Goldberg in 1968. In 1962, Republican Jacob Javits lost the Jewish vote to an Irish Democrat. One of the highly uncharacteristic Jewish phenomena of the first half of the 20th century was the Jewish gangster. Violence of any kind became abhorrent to Jews of the diaspora, although ancient Israel had its great warriors. Even boxers were denied burial in holy ground by Sephardic Jews when that sport first began in England. By and large, the Jewish neighborhoods on the Lower East Side of New York were peaceful, and few Jews were in prison or other penal institutions. Jews were more typically victims of crime rather than its perpetrators, but Among the second generation, as among other immigrant groups, there arose a tough criminal element. In 1909, 3,000 Jewish youngsters were brought before the juvenile court in New York, and afterward, Jewish adult gangsters became famous hoodlums. Prostitution appeared, to the alarm of the Jewish East Side community, one not used to such phenomena among Jews in Europe or America. But pimps, thieves, hoodlums, and gangland mobsters emerged among the second generation of East Side Jews. By the 1920s, Arnold Rothstein was the absolute boss of the New York underworld. The notorious Murder Incorporated Killers for Hire organization was headed by Jewish gangsters. In the largely Jewish garment industry in New York, gangsters were used by both labor and management during strikes, and some even became officials of both companies and unions. Another uncharacteristic occupation for the children of Jewish immigrants was that of boxer. Benny Leonard and Barney Ross were among the best known of the Jewish boxers in the early decades of the 20th century. Many fought professionally under Irish names because of the great reputation that Irish boxers had already established. With the general economic rise of Jews, Jewish boxers tended to disappear, along with Jewish mobsters. Both of these were dangerous occupations and have usually been avoided by groups that have worthwhile options elsewhere. One of the most traumatic events for later generations of American Jews occurred outside the United States: the rise of the Nazis in Germany and the subsequent Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews were brutally killed. Not only was this catastrophe horrifying in its method and magnitude, it was especially shocking in Germany, an advanced modern nation in which Jews had historically been more accepted and better treated than in many other parts of Europe. Only a generation earlier, during World War I, American Jewish publications had been so favorably disposed toward Germany that they were investigated and prosecuted by the U.S. government for writing favorably about an enemy nation in wartime. Oliver Wendell Holmes's clear and present danger doctrine arose in these cases during World War I, involving Jewish writers, Abram versus the United States and Schenck versus the United States. Even Germany could turn on Jews in this savage, genocidal fashion, could the Jews ever relax and quietly blend into the rest of the population? Being a Jew was no longer an incidental feature of one's life. The attempts of assimilationist Jews to be simply Germans of the Hebrew faith became a tragic and horrifying mockery and made Jewish identity and Jewish cohesion a more urgent issue for Jews everywhere. The Nazi extermination of Jews, while unique in itself, emphasized a long historic pattern of alternating rapprochement and rejection, protection and expulsion, prosperity and massacre, which had also marked the history of Jews in Spain, Poland, and Russia. A very different event, also abroad, strengthened Jewish identity in America in a much happier way: the establishment of the modern state of Israel. After centuries as a scattered people, living on the uncertain sufferance of others, Jews once again had a homeland. The fighting spirit that established and defended the new Israel countered the image of Jews as helpless, fearful people, as they had been in the era of the ghettos and the Pale. Jewish philanthropy, which had supported many civic and group-wide activities in America, also heavily supported the new state of Israel. Some American Jews even went to Israel to play important roles there. Golda Meir from Milwaukee was one of these. The sense of identity of American Jews today is not the old world religious sense of Jewishness. Most American Jews today do not observe the traditional Jewish Sabbath, nor are they active in the temple or synagogue. Their identity as Jews is an ethnic or racial identity, even though historically derived from a particular religion. Jewish Americans today. Jewish family incomes are the highest of any large ethnic group in the United States, 72% above the national average. While Jews are both older and better educated than other Americans, these factors alone do not account for all the differences. Even where neither education nor age is a factor, Jews earn more. Among families headed by males with 4 or more years of college and aged 35 to 44, Jews still earn 75% higher incomes. Part of the reason is that Jews have not only more education, but also better education from higher quality colleges and in more demanding and remunerative fields such as law, medicine, and science. Among families headed by males with less than 9 years of school and aged 35 to 44, Jews still earn higher incomes than others with the same characteristics. In short, there are other qualitative and cultural differences not captured in the statistics, which obviously have a major impact on the outcome. The work of women and children, which helped support Jewish immigrant families, today is no longer characteristic of Jewish families. A smaller proportion of Jewish families today have multiple earners than is true of American families in general. Even Jewish families with no one working have higher incomes than other families with no one working. Earnings from investments of one sort or another are apparently greater among Jews, as are other advantages built up in the past. In a sense, Jews are the classic American success story, from rags to riches against all opposition. Moreover, like other groups that have found in the United States opportunities denied them in their homelands, Jews have been proud and patriotic Americans. Yet the history of Jews is longer and larger than the history of the United States. At other times and other places, Jews have risen to heights of prosperity and influence, only to have it all destroyed in unpredictable outbursts of anti-Semitic fury. Jews could not readily become complacent members of the establishment, however much they might possess all of its visible signs. Jews have tended to remain on the political left, despite their affluence. Jews also remain overrepresented among radicals, although most Jews are not radical. As a distinguished scholar has observed, out of 100 Jews, 5 may be radicals. Out of 10 radicals, 5 are likely to be Jewish. Jews have contributed heavily to the support of liberal candidates, whether or not the candidates were themselves Jewish. Even when George McGovern was spurned by the general electorate in the 1972 presidential election, receiving only 38% of the popular vote, he still received 65% of the Jewish vote. Father Drinan, a liberal Roman Catholic, received 64% of the Jewish vote when he ran for Congress in 1970. By contrast, only 2% of the Jewish voters supported the 1972 presidential candidacy of George Wallace, who received more support than the 3% even among non-whites. The rise of affirmative action programs in the 1970s has split some Jewish groups from their traditional liberal and radical allies, including black civil rights organizations. The numerical goals and timetables for employment, promotion, or college admissions under such programs are reminiscent of quota systems used to restrict the opportunities of Jews in the past in the United States, and still more so in Europe. Moreover, Jews have struggled upward over the generations to a position where they are now overrepresented on university faculties, in high-level government positions, and in various industries and labor unions. The doctrine of demographic representation is necessarily detrimental to their current interests, regardless of its intent. Rare as the success of the Jews has been, it is not absolutely unique. Episcopalians, for example, have had higher incomes than Jews. It is the social and economic distance covered in a relatively short period of history that makes the story of Jewish Americans so remarkable.